Okay, well, on behalf of the Issam Ferris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, I'd like to welcome you all here. My name is Karim Makdisi. I'm the Associate Director of the Issam Ferris Institute, and I also teach in the Department of Politics here at AUB. The title of today's talk is Exploring the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine, Perspectives from the Global South. Before I introduce the speaker, the discussion about humanitarian intervention, the responsibility to protect, and related issues have been something that we at IFI, at the Issam Ferris Institute, have been tracking and following for the past couple of years. It's something that we've had a series of lectures and discussions about, and I encourage, especially after today's talk, I'm sure there'll be a lot of stimulated discussion. I encourage you all to go to our website to access some of these other discussions and lectures by other eminent scholars and policymakers. The concept of responsibility to protect, or R2P for short, sort of came about in the 1990s in its thought. In particular after the genocide in Rwanda and other similar events that took place, or massacres that took place during the 1990s, early and mid-1990s. And the UN, in particular the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, essentially after the Rwanda basically asked the question, so what do we do? How does the international community deal with this new rounds of massacres, humanitarian disasters, genocides, and other issues like this? It sort of, this discussion carried on, but it also manifested itself in a problematic way, which was through a kind of a doctrine of humanitarian intervention, or even what came to be called the Blair Doctrine after Tony Blair of the United Kingdom, which essentially many, if not all, but certainly many, certainly in the global south, saw as a form of a renewed form of sort of neo-colonial military intervention. So using humanitarian disasters as an excuse or justifications to just enter into many countries and impose a certain kind of political system or political solution. Within the UN itself, or within sort of the more respectable elements of the international community, an international commission was created in the year 2000, and a sort of an important or seminal document came out about a year later in 2001, so defining or expanding this notion of R2P, responsibility to protect. And basically the big story was that it moved away from the standard UN definition of sovereignty, meaning in its absolute sense, where there was no form of intervention allowed, at least technically by the UN Charter, to something that modifies this notion of sovereignty and makes it contingent on what comes to be known as this responsibility to protect. In other words, a state is now, according to this principle, responsible for the protection of its own citizens. And if that doesn't happen, then there is a potential justification for the international community to come in and protect these citizens, so even if the state is not doing that itself. The next big milestone was in 2005 when the UN General Assembly met and within the World Summit and adopted this responsibility to protect officially within the UN General Assembly. Of course, it's non-binding, but it's a principle. And just to very quickly read out the two kind of principal points that was in this document. The first one says, quote, each individual state has the responsibility to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So these are the four elements of what states and the international community need to be protecting. It then goes on to say in the second point that the international community, through the UN, also has a responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means in accordance with Chapter 6 and 7 or 6 and 8 of the Charter, to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It also then goes on to say that in worst case, Chapter 7 or sort of military use could be used in the extreme case to protect such civilians. These debates have continued. The Security Council adopted the same principle in 2006. And this has been debated quite a bit in both the UN and the policy and scholarly worlds. And some of the big questions that are probably going to be addressed today, and the big questions that are resonating everywhere are, one, is the R2P, and this I think is a theme for today's talk, is the responsibility to protect doctrine an emerging norm, or is it in fact an established norm? Is it something that everybody can appeal to, or is it still in the process of being legitimized and legitimated within the UN and the international community? What difference, if any, is there between this R2P and humanitarian intervention or military intervention, or indeed an older form of colonial meddling in the affairs of the global South? We had here a professor, an eminent scholar from Johns Hopkins a couple of months ago, Siboy Guvi, and he made this point very forcefully, that it was more of a kind of colonial, continuation of a colonial intervention into the global South. Again, another question is, what about the selective use by the international community of such principles and doctrines in the affairs of the third world and outside the third world? The most recent manifestation of this, of course, was via UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which authorized NATO essentially to come into Libya and intervene in Libya on the basis that there was an impending humanitarian crisis that Colonel Gaddafi was about to do in Libya. And of course, it was very controversial, and this has arguably led to even more of a discussion and led to hesitation in using these kinds of principles today, for instance, in Syria or Bahrain or other kinds of countries like this, because of the kinds of controversies that happened in its application in Libya, but not in, let's say, Palestine or other countries like that. So today's talk and discussion centers on this transmission or translation or interpretation of this global concept of the responsibility to protect into local cultural perspectives within the global South. Our speaker is Dr. Rama Mani, and she's a well-known and internationally reputed scholar and practitioner of peace, justice, and human security. She's, of course, much of her work and her scholarly output is based on her own experiences operating in many different countries and areas across the world and in these issues. She's currently the Councilor of the World Future Council, which is a group of eminent leaders from around the world that safeguards the right of future generations, which sounds extremely optimistic indeed. She's also a senior research associate at the Center for International Studies at the University of Oxford, and is directing a number of extremely interesting research projects that touch on a number of themes that we're going to be dealing with today. Just a note before I give the thing, I also want to introduce a colleague of mine in the politics department at AUB, Dr. Alexander Barder, who will also be giving, in about 5 minutes after the talk, will give a kind of will be essentially serve as a discussant for about 5 minutes to kick off the discussion. So please help me welcome Dr. Mani.
Thank you. If that's okay, I would like to stand just so I can kind of see most of the faces around this room, which means I have to hold on to this. That's lovely. I'm absolutely delighted to be here in the heart of Lebanon and Beirut at the American University of Beirut. Thank you very much for that very, very useful introduction. You helped me by not having to set the tone for my talk. Thank you very much to Dr. Rami Khoury and his great team at the Issam Institute. It's absolutely essential that at the heart of this esteemed university, there is a think tank like this that's drawing out the best from the scholars across the university and students like you. And I'm delighted to see so many of you looking like from different ages, backgrounds, professors, as well as students. Indeed, as Professor Makdisi has indicated, somehow my life seems to run in parallel with the very idea of the responsibility to protect. And finally, its rather reluctant acceptance by the UN at its 60th birthday party in New York in 2005, and then it's kind of dragging off its feet ever since till the current day when we see the situation right next door in Syria. Somehow along the way, I go back to thinking of my first job after my master's, where several of you might be in just a while, where I was working with the Commission on Global Governance. And in the year 2005, which was the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, we already optimistically believed that the time had come for something like a mechanism whereby the United Nations and the Security Council could say stop and stop the atrocities like Somalia and like Rwanda. Of course, that was a hope in vain, and the idea proposed by the Commission on Global Governance in its report, Our Global Neighborhood, presented to Boutros Ghali, the Egyptian Secretary General of the UN, presented in parallel at Davos, sort of, died without really making much of a whimper, but the atrocities continued around the world, which led to the process that has been described so well by Professor Makdisi. I was around, I happened to be in New York when finally the actual report that was described by Professor Makdisi was presented yet again to the UN, just unfortunately after 9/11 and the decision by the coalition to enter Afghanistan. So yet again, here is a great idea which gets buried by current events. So no one took attention of it till 2005. Anyway, let's move to the present moment, but before we do so, I want to start off by calling to mind, what has happened with R2P is we've got bogged down, as we are right now, in the whole discussion, the daily hand-wringing and holding of brows of why are we not doing more in cases like Syria. We've got bogged down in two kinds of discussions, both of which I think are equally futile. On the one hand is the one that Professor Makdisi referred to, which is what about internationally the hypocrisy, the double standards, why them and not us, what are the geostrategic and economic interests, all of that. And inside, when you actually look at what's happening within borders, we look at the venal, vested, political regime interests that prevent very often any meaningful intervention from taking place. But equally, we are bogged down in a futile discussion at the international level. And the futility there is either R2P has gotten boxed into legalistic definitions, is this going to be legal, is it going to be legitimate, etc., or into military discussions. What's the military capacity? What is the military needs? Do we have the money to finance this, etc.? And both of them just leave us in a point of sort of status quo, and we don't move. What I think we need, and I'm a political scientist, I studied, like I believe yourself, Professor Bader, I did my master's at Johns Hopkins, my Ph.D. at Cambridge, all in political science and international relations. But I've begun to realize after 20 years of working on peace building, on post-conflict justice, and you know that it's very difficult to be optimistic when you work on these subjects, to realize that we have become too narrow in our perspective. And no wonder we get stuck in these debates which don't take us anywhere. And we need to do what our forefathers and foremothers knew how to do, which is take a step back and look philosophically, look from the depth of our ancient wisdom, our ancient philosophical wisdom, as well as our current wisdom, to draw a better conclusion on what we might do with R2P. So let's begin with Lao Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, who very wisely said, he could have been whispering in the ear of every Middle Eastern and global diplomat and politician, he said, if you want to govern the people, you must place yourself below them. If you want to lead the people, you must first learn to follow them. And as you can see, just like in 1989, when the people of Central and Eastern Europe tried to give this lesson to their leaders, just like thereafter, as it's happened around the world, it started happening in this part of the world with the Arab Spring, the leaders didn't really, not many of them wanted to take that lesson. But we don't need to go so far, because right here in the heart of the Middle East, there have been great philosophers like Farabi, who wrote Al-Madina Al-Fadila, The Ideal City, where he waxed at length about the qualities and the qualifications which made a ruler worthy of the sovereign responsibility of governance. Indeed, there has been no other issue that has been as much debated from the beginning of human time to the present day as the relationship between ruler and ruled, between citizen and state, and citizen and sovereignty. And despite all of that, what do we find? That we are unable to learn from history, even forget ancient history, but recent history, except perhaps to repeat the mistakes with even more grotesque consequences each time. So let us take a look then at some of the lessons that we might draw from recent history, from the cases which actually informed the formation of the principle of R2P and could possibly inform its application, especially in this part of the world, but also perhaps more broadly. Let's start with Rwanda, which, as you well mentioned, Professor Makdisi, was the start of the never again rhetoric in the international community. When we went with this book, which I'll talk about later, to look at what would actually happen if instead of remaining at this level of international analyses and hand-wringing, we went down and asked scholars in civil society on the ground what their internal perspectives and analysis was of the reasons underlying all of the political and why did you abandon us kinds of analyses we see. The core finding is that a genocide or a mass atrocity never happens overnight. It takes a systematic practice and a policy, a systematic policy, meaning state-governed, of what would be called cultural ethnocide to prepare the ground for what then becomes the outbreak of violence as we saw in 100 days when close to 1 million lives were lost in Rwanda. It is very clear, said the great scholars like Jean-Marie Kayishema, a very reputed anthropologist of Rwanda, that you cannot believe that people will go against the taboos, the cultural practices, the values that have been the mainstay of their culture for thousands of years in a matter of a fraction of an eye. This has to be planned by a practice of by a policy of cultural ethnocide. So we ignore these signs at our peril. And just last week in Jordan, when I was speaking to a good friend, a former minister of Bahrain, and understanding the situation of what is going on over there, it would be good for us to begin to see, however small they may seem in the beginning, when there are trends towards what could become cultural ethnocide and thus one day genocide. Let us move to Kosovo, which was a tipping point. You would remember that at that point, we had not yet had the commission, we had not yet had the articulation of the policy, but that was when the hand-wringing was at its greatest, where there was an agonizing decision, should we or should we not intervene to save these people who seem to be facing an ethnic cleansing by Milosevic. In the end, as you remember, it was a NATO intervention, and as you would also remember, after that, liberal thinkers, I would admit, myself included, for a long time thought, oh, I mean, really, this was just another case of convenient military intervention. What purpose did it really serve? And that's what I felt until I went to the ground and spoke to Kosovo Albanians. And regardless of their background, whether high intellectuals, young, bright scholars, or people on the streets of any background, there was not one who felt it was too much or too early. Rather, they said, number one, why did you have to wait till the last minute? Why did we have to wait to be treated like cattle in the heart of Europe where you have seen this happening before you came? Would you have come, all of the things of double questioning, if there weren't, well, the Lewinsky phenomenon is what the Kosovars would call it. Some of you may be too young to remember that, but was it American politics that led to your decision to come? But more important were two little observations they made. Number one, why did you not do something before we came to this stage? Why did you not even notice when for 10 years the entire society, civic society, got together, forgot its own old clan and tribal differences, and united in a civic opposition, a non-violent civic opposition to military occupation by the Milosevic Serbian regime? Only when we gave up, because no one was listening, did we move towards a state of armed conflict. And the minute we started throwing bombs and shooting, you showed up at our doorstep. So what kind of message are you sending to others who believe that a peaceful, nonviolent means might be a good way to go about changing an oppressive regime? They also pointed to something else which has completely escaped our notice as political and legal scholars, despite our deep analysis of the situation. What our Kosovar scholars told us is one thing was critically important to enable the deeply divided, tribal, ethnically divided, clan-based society of Kosovo, of Kosovo Albanians, which was they mobilized an ancient principle which is called besa, which basically is like the Arabic principle of honor. And they said before you believed it was your honor to kill someone of the other clan if they kill someone of your clan, right? Or to make peace by giving your daughter in marriage to the other family. Now, let us use besa in a way that might actually help us instead of hurting us. Let us use our own principle of honor to forget our old vendettas, to stop wasting our time and auto-destructing ourselves by fighting each other, and let's unite in non-violent opposition against the outside occupier, which at that time was Milosevic. And that was what worked. And it was intellectuals like yourselves, young activists like yourselves, who went out, and the elders who went out clan by clan and forged this unity amongst the people. And it stood for 10 years, despite huge military means being used and oppressive and humiliating means being used by the Serbian regime. And all of that we stoically ignored. Let's move on to Nepal. We never talk about Nepal in discussions of R2P. And yet I remember meeting after meeting, being with the very people like Lakhdar Brahimi, like Gareth Evans, a good friend who has possibly done more than any other single human being to push the concept of the responsibility to protect to adoption and implementation. He was a former foreign minister of Australia. And all of these people, which during the worst stage of the crisis in Nepal, the talk in the corridors was, Nepal could be the next Rwanda. Let's prepare ourselves. And the other thing I remember, speaking to Nepali civil activists, they would say, you know, in our culture, it is not in our culture to go out onto the streets and protest, because, you know, there is Hinduism and Buddhism and all kinds of reasons. And before you knew it, something changed. The genocide never happened. Instead, people of all religious and cultural backgrounds, all castes, all tribal groups went out in the streets and launched a Jan Andolan, which means a people's revolution, a people's movement, and ended the war, ended the royalty, and completely changed the face of that country. It's a tragedy that one of the most comprehensive peace agreements, which the people, with some help in the background by the international community, but the people themselves forged. And when we went to the ground and asked local scholars, what happened? What led to you not having the kind of mass atrocities that other cases have had? They said, of course, it was very helpful that the media and the international community and human rights observers, all of that was good. But actually, there was something else. Yes, it was the people who came out there and put aside their differences because they were united by this common cause. It was the arts, because we were dancing in the streets and singing slogans, and we had comedians and we had singers who would use our old chants adjusted to new not revolutionary, but democratic messages. It was theater, which was all over the streets when we were doing this. It was what is called the artivists, the artists who joined the public. But there was also something else. And they again pointed to the cultural institutions and the cultural values that protected people, and why, after such a terrible war, the death toll, I shouldn't use the word only because even a single death is too much, was about 14,000. It was terrible, but they did not have 40,000 or 60,000 as we now have in Syria. And what they said is there were fascinating things, like whereas I have heard in Cambodia or in Rwanda that people say, we don't understand why brother killed sister, why mother killed child, why husband massacred wife. Over here, people who did not even know each other said, oh, but how could I kill him? He is my clan brother, which meant that according to this ancient principle, the friend of a friend is actually like your brother and you protect him or her. And many people, there were Maoist guerrillas who would get shelter by a government official or a military man. I have a good friend, a civic activist, who jumped over when he heard that the death squad was coming for him. He jumped over the roof in his pajamas and was sheltered by a royalist. and then taken out with the help of diplomats outside the country. So there were these practices and the cultural institutions in the villages far away from where the human rights observers and international presence was, that was able to protect people and protect themselves from both the government and the guerrillas. So all of this points to the fact that in our understanding of what really happens when there are mass atrocities and what needs to happen, what would be the most appropriate thing to happen, and how might we act once we have come in. For example, the fact that Kosovars say, we will never dispute the fact that you should have come in. You should have come in much earlier. The only thing we have an unction with, that we have a problem with, is you came in and we welcomed you with open arms, because our culture believes in hospitality. We treated you as our honored guests until you started treating us as if we were guests in our own home. Worse, you treated us like strangers and did not allow us to express our own opinions of what we wanted to see as the future of our country. So we have problems about how we go about the intervention, who intervenes, but also how we pull out. Look at Afghanistan, where I've been in and out, both at the beginning and more recently, and seen why is it that we simply do not know when to go in, on what basis, but also how to stay and maintain our legitimacy and how to leave in a better state. And that's why we felt it was absolutely imperative, I, with my many years of experience in peace building, where I can see that the phenomenal, catastrophic often, lack of success, the fact that 50%, now we say 60% as of 2012, of the cases where we have emerged from conflict with a seeming peace agreement and yet relapsed into violent conflict within 5 to 10 years, is because we have grotesquely ignored anything but the surface military, economic, and political considerations. We have failed to understand the real wishes of the very diverse local populations and completely failed to understand the diversity and complexity of local culture. No wonder we go around the world talking about the Lebanization of X and Y when we don't understand Lebanon in the first place. So it's easy for us to just draw these generalizations. No wonder we try to impose one solution which seemed to have worked in one country in another country, and in the meanwhile, it's collapsed in the country that we borrowed it from. All of this led me to a profound belief that we have to look at culture, and by culture I mean philosophy and ethics, which used to be the foundation of governance, the foundation of our métier of political science, and now has become so grotesquely divorced from political science that we are shocked not when we meet a respectable, a criminal politician, but when we meet a respectable politician. And not just in this part of the world. I come originally from India, and when you have the world's largest democracy, where most of the members of parliament have a criminal record, and when the entire country goes on strike demanding an end to corruption, and the government simply takes no notice, you get a sense that this is not a particularly Middle Eastern phenomenon. So we have to look at philosophy and ethics. We have to look at religions, which have become a cause of division, but below the religions and their divisive factors, we need to look at the spiritual values and traditions which have persisted despite the divisiveness of religions and somehow managed to infiltrate society and sometimes can be evoked towards more peaceful behavior. And funnily enough, but I hope not so strange in this extraordinarily artistically endowed culture, we also have to look at art. Because art often lands up expressing that which we cannot say when civic protest is shut off. Why do we have graffiti in Palestine or in East Timor? Why do we have, for example, the children and the grown-ups in South Africa who would every single march go dancing and singing? Why do we have the guns being made into sculpture in Mozambique? Or the poetry, the ancient ballads in Somalia now being sung as anti-war songs? Or even in Peru, the Quechua women, the native Indian women who used to sew their little quilts, now sew Kalashnikovs and scenes of war and peace. All of these are signs to us of what a population really wants, what it really thinks of its government, and what it thinks of the international forces and what they are doing or not doing. I could wax on at great length about the importance of what we found by looking at philosophy and ethics, religion and culture, religion and spirituality, and art and aesthetics in what we called the global south, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. For example, the sense that comes out of ethics that there is a categorical moral imperative to act, to save people who are endangered. However, the categorical imperative means you don't wait till the last minute. You begin to act much before the fact, when trouble starts. For example, of course, religions which say, yes, the golden rule, do unto others as you would do unto yourself, life is divine, so don't hurt others. But much more important, that Islam and Christianity, the two fundamental religions over here, as well as all the other major religions and indigenous spiritual traditions, talk not just of the responsibility of sovereigns who have to act in a manner that merits their right to govern, but it also talks of the responsibility of citizens to protest and to oppose tyranny. That is a core value that gave birth to the just war theory in the Christian tradition and is a core value even in Islam. Just as Islam says if you kill one human being, you kill all of humanity, and if you save one human being, you save all of humanity, Islam also says you must oppose tyranny. Right? It is not acceptable for anyone to be tyrannical or unjust. And I've already talked about the importance of art, which I had begun to notice already in the year 2000 when I was working in the Horn of Africa on conflicts in that region. And I realized it actually in Somalia, but I noticed it all over the world where I've been, in Afghanistan, across Latin America, across the Middle East, across Africa. And what one sees is that art has played a vital role before conflicts and helping to control them and not become as violent as they've been, but even during the worst periods of conflict in some of the ways that I've outlined. And of course, as we see in Lebanon and around the region today, after conflict, by mobilizing people, by uniting people across divided lines. I take the case, for example, of Bosnia. Do you know that during the height of the war, at night, just when the last bomb had fallen and the last gunshots were heard, the people on the opposing sides in Sarajevo, in Mostar, would put down their guns, draw the curtains, pick up their guitars, their drums, and start playing music. The Sevda Cafe, one of the best musical groups in Bosnia, was born through that friendship that was created during the war while the bombs were falling. So enemies by day, but at night they found a terrain d'entente, a place where they could actually communicate with each other. And examples like this abound. I would end by saying, however, that it's not simply that this all points towards an importance of culture, of ethics and philosophy, the psychology of different people within societies and conflict, and the role of art in and of itself. It points, I think, also to a need to come back to the fundamental principle of creativity, which we have completely lost in politics nationally and at the international realm, in the international community, and in international politics. That's why we go back to the same tried, tested, and failed means of trying to prevent conflict or end mass atrocities. That's why our interventions are often so unsuccessful. If we are not creative from our very youth in finding new solutions to the problems we have, if we simply accept that's the way it's going to be, we are in big trouble. You know, Ibn Arabi, one of the greatest philosophers of this part of the world, said, the heart has two eyes. One is reason, the other is imagination. We believe we are being reasonable and rational. Where did our imagination go? And if we do not get it back, where will we be? Ibn Arabi also said, which is it's as if he was speaking to the young people on the streets across this region right today. He said, opt for freedom. And with this new freedom, fight the tyranny of the ego. Sit on the throne of the intellect. Put the crown of service on your head. Judge, not with preconception, but by the reality of the now. The truth is in the present. he could equally have been speaking to the leaders of this region. But if you feel that a philosopher is too far away from reality, let us go back to the craftsman of the principle of the responsibility to protect. I mentioned Gareth Evans before. In fact, exactly a year ago, I was in Melbourne, and we were jointly launching this book, Responsibility to Protect, in the University of Melbourne, which looks in a sense quite similar to your gorgeous campus here at the American University of Beirut. And I was actually shocked, as I was flying to Lebanon, a friend sent me a copy of an op-ed article that he wrote at the end of last year. And this gentleman, who is a political pragmatist, a realist, if by the book definition, you know what he said, commenting on the conflicts in this region? He has been working tirelessly he worked on Libya, working on Syria. He remains the emeritus president of the International Crisis Group that tries to prevent mass atrocities and conflict. And he said, the problem is our vision of the world, our presuppositions affect what we think. If we are pessimists and we expect that the world will be conflict inevitably, then we tend to operate in that way and tend to act out of a spirit of competition. But if we are optimists and we believe and continue to practice cooperation, and we expect that people will act according to human values, so will it be. And he ended by saying, if we want to change the world for the better, we must start by believing that it's possible. And if Gareth Evans can, I believe all of us can, and using both our reason and our imagination, we have every means of doing so. As you can see, I haven't talked specifically about the cases in the Middle East and what they're going through now, but I wanted us very much to step back and bring in this broader perspective so that when we go back to our questions, we could think, are we allowing ourselves to be bogged down by the narrowness that has limited our imagination and our ability to act in ways that are in the better interest of the people and the countries so far? And can we now actually arm ourselves with this to think of new alternatives which might be both more creative but also much more appropriate and long-lasting in this region? I'll be delighted to discuss all of these issues with you and to look more closely at the cases in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mani, for a very stimulating discussion and for a call to think about these issues in a new and imaginative way and moving it away from cranky politics academics such as ourselves. And hopefully the students here in particular will be able to use this use this as an inspiration, that is to say, for what's going on in the region today. And hopefully there'll be more discussion about that. Before we open it up for general discussion, I'd like to invite my colleague Alex Barter to just speak for a few minutes as a discussant.
Great, thank you for a wonderful talk. So, in the brief time that I have, I'd like to make a few general comments. First, I want to stress the importance and significance of the edited volume that Rama Mani and Thomas Weiss have organized and put forth. Debates concerning the emerging or emerged norm of R2P have historically occurred within very narrow confines, largely Western academic and policy-making institutions. What both Mani and Weiss have done, along with the contributors to the volume, is not only to broaden the scope to include critical perspectives from the Global South, but especially to show that thinking about R2P also necessitates a detour through subjects ranging from aesthetics, religion, spirituality, and in particular culture. What I think Mani and Weiss develop is a thought-provoking interdisciplinary study that should serve as the methodological fulcrum for exploring other topics central to global governance more generally. So second, and more specifically to questions pertaining to R2P, I'd like to maybe just make two general observations concerning the international historical and political context that perhaps underlies the urgency of R2P. So here I'll be very schematic in the interest of time. So responsibility to protect. The term appears to comprise, on the one hand, an obligation and an action. An obligation supposedly universal in scope, to protect vulnerable populations subject to state violence. This obligation potentially leads to, in extreme cases, military intervention in order to protect such populations. Now, I think that one of the central issues of modernity and modern political thought is precisely this question of protection of the individual or group. The novelty of Thomas Hobbes's political thought in his classic work, The Leviathan, was precisely to justify the instantiation of the Commonwealth in terms of protection. The ultimate rationalization for the Commonwealth was the establishment of a covenant between individuals to allow for protection through obedience to either a sovereign by institution or by acquisition. Protection then is based on obedience, motivated by fear. To be protected then means to be part of a sovereign state, and ultimately, as time went forward, to then possess civil, political, and legal rights. To be outside the state, then, is to inhabit the state of nature, perpetually under threat of violent death. There is then a strong tendency to associate the concept of protection with state protection. The laws of nations concerning the responsibilities and obligations of states vis-à-vis individuals are always conceived as state obligations. So that when we typically think about something like R2P, we think about the obligation of a state or states or councils made up of states to organize the conditions for reestablishing this inherent relationship, protection with ultimately obedience. One corollary of this is that states that engage in catastrophic violence are states that obviously negate the protection side of the equation. Such states lack then the inherent attributes of legitimacy that are conditioned on the respect of the individual or group. In IR, in international relations that is, in particular, there's a strong tendency to fall back into a Western centrism about what constitutes the proper modern state that needs to be implemented in order to prevent such violence. Put differently, if we are to think about moving beyond this Western centrism, do we also need to think beyond the state as the primary apparatus for creating conditions of protection? Or are we trapped in this logic of protection, obedience, fear that underpins modern processes of state formation? So why do I think this is important? I think that there are larger questions about the relationship between R2P, humanitarian intervention more generally, and the crisis of the modern nation-state system. Now, Hannah Arendt, for example, recognized quite clearly that the catastrophes of the 1940s was linked to the crisis of the European state system as a result of imperialism and the First World War. Faced with masses of stateless peoples as a result of the disintegration of old imperial powers, nation-states could not reconcile their obligations to maintain internal homogeneity with obligations of asylum and protection. In other words, I wonder if current discourses about R2P actually in a way reflect a much more fundamental crisis of the international political order that neglects such issues as political, social, and especially economic inequality and insecurity that gives rise to instances of mass violence. Now lastly, following this last point, I wonder also about the relationship between R2P and instances of mass structural violence. Lack of access to basic necessities for human needs calls into question an international political and economic order that perpetrates harm to billions of people and creates conditions of mass violence. It's here, I think, that voices from the global south can make an important difference. By stressing the intrinsic inequality of our global order, we perhaps move beyond thinking of R2P as simply a band-aid until the next crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very thoughtful remarks. I'd like to open it up to discussion, questions, points raised. Please identify yourselves.
My name is Christelle Van Wood, and I'm a PS.
Sorry, could you just pull in closer?
Sorry. My name is Christelle Van Wood, and I'm a political science major. I'm a senior, and I have two main questions regarding the idea of responsibility to protect. So basically, you're asking us to be empathetic, being in the other culture's vantage point, to understand them rationally, what their values are, through integrating the ideas of ethics with our decision-making with respect to politics. But is the real intent, is it we can approach this issue from from a policy-oriented perspective rather than an ideological perspective. So if the nature of the conflict is ideological, can we still approach it this way? I mean, do people still have that same intent? I mean, in a hostile environment, when people just interfere based on humanitarian interests, the variables keep on changing. So when the variables keep on changing, the intent sometimes changes. And how do you kind of control that? By reintegrating ethics again, or you just have to wait until the status quo goes back to how it used to be? So that was basically my main question.
And the second one?
The second one is regarding, is the real intent that humanitarian, or were there more incentives? I mean, the real motive for any peacekeeper to interfere is, of course, you know, it's security related. I mean, what are they initially getting out of it? I mean, or is it just pure intent? Is it? That's also another question. Like, what have you been observing?
Should I go ahead and just respond? Great. Thank you very much, Crystal, for that question, for those two questions. Very good point, because I think that is very much the dilemma that we are faced with, not simply when we are trying to make a decision, should we intervene, and how? You know, there's R2P, as Professor Makdisi had indicated, there's a whole scale, there's a spectrum of possibilities, with military intervention being the last resort. And as I mentioned, of course, in the debates about it, and right now as with Syria, but in every other case, you know, it was the same with Cote d'Ivoire and with Libya. That's all we talk about. And if we do intervene, we are damned because the Western community must have vested interests, and it's yet another case of imperial intervention. But if they don't intervene, it's because they hate our culture, and it's because of the color of our skin and who we are. So what does that mean? That in the end of the day, the people on the ground, those who are actually facing the bombs because they don't have bulletproof vests, or they don't have access to bomb shelters and so on, or they're not sitting on the inside of a tank with lots of weapons, are the ones, like the residents of central Beirut, packed in these narrow streets, who are the casualties. So when you talk about ideas, so it's as much a question when we are talking about what kind of R2P intervention as for those who go in as peace mediators. Can we actually bring questions of ethics when we are talking to these two parties or many parties who have done as bad things as each other for ideological reasons, believing they were doing absolutely what they had to do according to their ideology or according to their God or whatever it is? The fact is that when we have not taken into consideration larger factors in making that decision, whether it's having that peace negotiation or whether it is how do we intervene, what means do we use at what times, in order ideally to forestall the need for a military intervention. And if we have a military intervention, how do we go about it? Who should it be? You know, what color of skin and what color of uniform and all of that, etc. When we do not bring in the deeper dimensions, what you called the ethical dimensions, we have done so at our peril. It may have been that we've provided an expedient short-term response. It may have been that we got a peace agreement that guaranteed what we call a negative peace, a cessation of hostilities. But look at case after case where we didn't go a little bit below to refer to the absolutely brilliant points you raised, Alex Barder, the structural violence, which was the cause of the conflict in the first place, the profound humiliation, often for decades or centuries, that pushed people to that point. When we don't look at these and we remain on this superficial ideological level, the outcome is always catastrophic in the long run. So in the end of the day, we think it's a choice. I won't name names because there's certain people who are still very prominent in negotiating the peace outcomes in this very region. But I can remember back in Afghanistan where certain people in high levels would say, you know, we can't think of issues of justice and human rights. It's all very nice, but it has to be thought about later. The only problem is it's not human rights. It's the people who are violating the rights of citizens are the warlords, are the criminal gangsters who are causing the prolongation of the conflict. So to say that that's a later issue simply means that you're not doing what's in your own best interest. So we simply have to put aside the sense that, you know, in the short term, we can't afford to be ethical, because actually that means we are not being very practical or very reasonable. The second one that you asked is, you know, this utterly fundamental question, because until we can believe that the intent of the international community, whatever that nebulous entity might be, is benevolent, is for the greater good, primarily of the population, the civic population on the ground, of the country as a whole, and hopefully of the world community, we will never trust R2P. And it's true that so far there are enough cases that point towards factors which lead us to distrust it. Now, interestingly, my colleague Thomas Weiss, I'd love to send you the article to those interested, just wrote this year a piece reflecting on the different cases of R2P use, misuse, or non-use, including Syria. And he feels that even the case of Syria indicates the key question you raised at the beginning, that the actual core validity, the consensus around R2P, has actually not been substantially weakened or shaken, even by the grotesque lack of the international community and the regional powers to do anything to stop the massacres on the ground. He feels that cases like Côte d'Ivoire, where it's hard to think that there was an ulterior motive. So I think each time we think of cases with an ulterior motive, we need to think at the same time of cases where there wasn't one and think, so it seems that the international community is profoundly, like all of us human beings, complex and paradoxical. We, you know, defend something one day and do the opposite the next day, and the international community, being even more complex and mixed, does just the same. So sometimes it seems to genuinely want to do things in the best interest of the local population, even when it doesn't stand to gain too much economically or militarily. Those cases are very, very few. And then there are lots of cases where it doesn't or does act based on other interests. Ideally, what we need to realize is until we act more consistently, there will not be a change, not simply in the efficacy of the system, but more importantly, in the trust that young generations place in it. And in every country where I've spoken to the younger generations, to people like yourselves, I have seen that the great thing about your generation is you will not tolerate the grotesque stupidity of the political generation that exists now. You want those leaders, because they are out there, who actually look you in the eye and act based on decency, based on honesty and integrity, right? And the younger generations are saying, we don't trust the UN. We don't know who you are, right? When you show us that you act consistently, we will trust you and we will believe that you're acting in our interest. And the same with our national leaders. A long answer, but to a very good question.
My name is Kohali Hindawi, and I teach international relations and international law here at the UB. I would like to thank you for your presentation. I've been myself working also on this R2P concept and calling in a similar way, I think, some common ground for reappropriation of the concept by individuals who are moved by a responsibility to act when the so-called international community does not. And you know, from that perspective, your presentation was very inspiring. So when you're stressing this importance of looking at culture, philosophy, ethics, spiritual values, arts, stressing at the responsibility of the sovereign, but also of citizens to protest, to oppose tyranny, and to use creativity to do so, to react to massive violence, and Alex Barder was adding to oppose massive structural violence. But at the same time, you were talking about Kosovo, an instance of military intervention, you were talking about Ivory Coast, Libya. So I still can't get how you connect your argument with the conventional discourse or R2P. So focusing on the international community reacting through the UN Security Council. So could you please elaborate a bit?
Absolutely. A great way to respond to that is a discussion we had a year ago in Melbourne with Gareth Evans and a very large audience like this of students as well as citizens from the society and scholars and professors. And what was interesting is Gareth Evans himself, who has been at the end of urging military intervention when all other means have failed, and insisting that R2P needs to be what he calls at the hard edge. So not look at issues which are of deep concern to Alex or myself, which are structural violence, deep inequalities, etc., which of course are very important, he would acknowledge, but shouldn't come within the R2P remit because it would dilute it. And what he said last year, he was just coming back from New York, believe it or not, talking about Syria, and that was a year ago with a lot less deaths. And he said, because when we started this project, he felt, well, it's all very well, Rama, I trust you if you want to work on these issues, but, culture and ethics and philosophy, honestly, we need to be looking at the issues which really influence political decision-making, the kind of question that Christal was raising. And he said, I have to admit that our inability to understand and pay attention to cultural considerations has been a large part of our failure in all of the cases in the past and even right now. We have to admit that our difficulty to get action around Syria and the reason why it's not simply the usual suspects, but even countries like South Africa and Brazil and India that are protesting and are very wary is because of the way we acted in Libya. So there is a real shift in realizing that it's not simply something nice to look at these cultural issues, but when we are actually looking at a situation which is edging its way towards one of mass atrocities, where we know that if we do not act today, we will be trying, sitting in the Security Council or in NATO, trying to decide on the hard end of military intervention. It's at that time we need to think about things like, what is this culture specifically? What is its particular geographical, historical, multicultural specificity? What do the local people actually want? Understanding that there is going to be a great diversity of what they want, and that's going to, as you said before, Christal, change over time as allegiances on the ground change. And also, what does the region find acceptable? And therefore, how do we fine-tune the many tools we have at our disposal, just as we do in a military intervention? Should it be airstrikes, or should it be, boots on the ground, or should it be, I don't know, a free a safe fly zone? In the same way, to tune all of the other interventions to the actual realities on the ground, which are shaped by these cultural features, and to continue that logically through. So once you enter the country, you don't then just get bunkered up in your, inside your tank or inside your compound, which is the case. Look at Rwanda today, where my driver said to me, what a pity that all the internationals have made themselves prisoners inside their compounds, and they can't actually go out to see what's happening in the country. Right? So once we are in there, how do we act in a way that we remain cognizant of, responsive to, informed by local people of different backgrounds, local stakeholders, and spokespersons for different parts of society, and how they are evaluating and judging what we do. So it's this kind of the whole range of it. It's not, it's at every stage of R2P, as you mentioned, as well as ideally in every other issue of global governance, to be constantly informed by and fine-tuning our awareness, our understanding, and adapting it to what happens in each case, or what needs to happen, and being honest to evaluate, likewise, thereafter, what we did wrong, and fine-tune it again in the next case.
I'll make mine short. My name is Mahad Amaj, and I've worked on humanitarian interventions in the past, not all successfully, but I want to go back to a particular point you mentioned, is that genocides don't happen overnight, and that there's a culture of ethnocide that is usually propagated by policies and so on. And you also mentioned that in some of the cases that you proposed, that you studied, that there was a whole years of nonviolence activism or resistance, but the intervention came about when violence struck. And I would really like to ask, are you proposing, is there a way, is there a mechanism that right to protect can be invoked earlier, that, you know, as a preventive measure? And is there a legitimate mechanism that is being discussed? Because I think that would be...
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because the whole idea, you know, when humanitarian intervention came up, as was mentioned by Professor McDeasy, you know, in the 90s, this was the aftermath of Somalia, and after Somalia, immediately you had Rwanda, etc. And so there came the right to humanitarian intervention, le droit d'ingérence, right? And that was coming out of a civic tradition. It was, gosh, I'm going to embarrass myself and forget the name of the French foreign minister, not foreign minister, who invented the concept.
Bernard Kouchner.
Bernard Kouchner, coming out of the MSF and Médecins Sans Frontières movement and Médecins du Monde movement, saying we have to act based on, and we have to consider it a right. And that was the reason for this absolute knee-jerk reaction of the newly independent states. I tell you, when I was working on the Commission on Global Governance and we would talk about, you know, I mean, after all, what do we do when there are mass atrocities? The Indian government would be the first to just absolutely get visceral and angry at the very idea. And that is why the whole concept of responsibility to protect changed the terms of the debate. And just as Karim explained why the word responsibility was used instead of the right, and you beautifully explained the whole concept of protection, it was a deep discussion in the small commission. And interestingly enough, one of the members of the commission was Cornelius Somaruga, another very dear friend. It turns out that many of the members of the commission are or have become dear friends. He was the head of the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, whose entire work is the preservation of humanitarian law, and the concept of protection is absolutely essential to it. And he was the one in one of their discussions who said, you know what, let's shift away from the word intervention and let's go towards the concept of protection. Even protection has its problems, and I was absolutely stunned by the way you problematized it. But already it was a huge shift to take away the wariness of the governments who hated the idea of intervention. But likewise on responsibility, to move it away from a right to responsibility. Now, the key concept there was, if we believe that it's only intervention as military, we are doomed. So we have to have the 3 pillars and the preventive pillar. And what's been very interesting is because of the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's understanding of the reluctance of many states to have anything to do with military intervention, the side that he and his special advisor till recently, Edward Luck, have really emphasized is the preventive side and what they call the capacity building side. So they have really built up that side. You're absolutely right that so far, what has it meant? Platitudes. It has meant, oh, maybe we give more development assistance, which of course is going to lead to zero. However, the interesting thing is that just as there was such a fight about R2P and so many countries tried to bury or kill R2P after 2005, cleverly enough, Edward Luck, the special advisor till recently, and Ban Ki-moon have seen, you know, what in a sense the funny thing is what Kofi Annan, you know, Kofi Annan's greatest passion was the culture of prevention. And maybe he managed to promote it to a certain extent, but he didn't really succeed to entrench this whole preventive culture in the UN by the time he left. And in a funny way, I see it as a way in which behind him and through the back door, countries begin to see what they hated, which is conflict prevention and genocide prevention. They prevented prevention being addressed at the 60th anniversary of the UN. They didn't want the Peacebuilding Commission to look at peacebuilding as prevention, but it's come back through the back door because they prefer prevention to military intervention. I think it would be absolutely fantastic if scholars like yourself were really contributing to saying, it's not good enough. If you want to be serious about prevention, don't go back to platitudes about, oh, development and, oh, you know, preventive diplomacy, but let's have something much more substantial because it has to be done. And certain people like the co-chair of the commission, Mohamed Sahnoun, an Algerian diplomat who himself faced the war of independence from France and was imprisoned, tortured, etc., a great, great diplomat, has been pushing very much for the approach of prevention as the most appropriate and successful way to go forward with R2P.
Hello. My name is Mohammed Sabaiti. I'm a former military officer.
Great.
I'm interested with everything you said.
Do your parents know about this?
Yes. Thank you. Up to my recollection, I remember what we called the Uniting for Peace Resolution of the 1950 during the Korean War, where the General Assembly can have necessary measures under Chapter 7 and when Security Council is paralyzed by the use of veto. My question is, how you can integrate this concept of resolution with the R2P for better outcome? My second question, within the scope of your diversified expertise, have you yourself imagined a rational paradigm that can be recommended to the catastrophic Syrian issue? Thank you.
Oh, those two simple questions, right? I could just ask for my colleagues to help respond to that. So, great questions. So the first one, you were referring to the General Assembly decision in Korea, and did you want to ask about how to link conflict resolution with R2P, or to ask whether the General Assembly mechanism could be reactivated? It is still, yes. You know, the sad thing is, for the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a great deal of discussion of why can't we use this General Assembly principle again. Possibly the one case where it was sort of used indirectly was, it wasn't a case of an intervention as such, but, the fact that the Palestinians decided to go to the General Assembly with this vote, knowing that they would get a majority to get their enhanced status in the United Nations. Whenever there has been the thought of trying to use it for a case which would involve a military intervention or hard intervention, the fact is that even the General Assembly, or even more the General Assembly, we are usually so busy criticizing the Security Council that we tend to overlook the huge problems with the General Assembly. The fact that even on issues like R2P, the power of the G77, within G77, the regional blocs tends to be quite strong. So even if you find that the majority, for example, of, say, African states have been the greatest and most vocal defenders of the concept of R2P, why? Because they know the consequences if you look the other way when their people are being massacred. Yet, if there's one country, I'll just take it as an example, if at some point it was Algeria, that is opposed to it, it could turn out that the African bloc will not vote for such for an action. Likewise, most of Latin America is very supportive, but if you have a Cuba or a Venezuela, they may have great economic and health and social security policies, but if it comes to an issue where they see the nebulous hand of foreign imperialism, they will immediately vote against it, which means you lose the whole Latin America and Caribbean bloc. So we like to think that the General Assembly is a great way out because we think that the Security Council is, is incapable of making consistent decisions or avoiding the double standards. But oftentimes the best decisions still end up coming from the Security Council despite all the mistakes it makes or the cases of omission, because the General Assembly remains rather divided. So that's the big problem that I see with trying to use the General Assembly, unless it's really, there are hardly any cases today which aren't divisive between the different blocs. Is there a rational paradigm for Syria? Unfortunately, my handicap is having worked for 20 years on peace building, or the lack thereof, the fact that I have so few cases to share where I think the situation after forget even, after there's been even a peacekeeping force, is substantially better for the first 10 or 15 years afterwards, makes me very hesitant to think that military intervention is ever a good thing. I think one of our big problems is we haven't managed to find, when people are being killed using arms, even if it's just machetes, all the way up to the kind of very sophisticated machinery that's being used in Syria, we haven't found the most effective way to end that. Could Mali be a case of the opposite? I was speaking to a Malian former minister just here in Byblos this week. We were at a meeting, and he says, yes, the beginning is very promising, but the hard work is still to come. Just like we thought in Iraq after the first couple of weeks, it's done, khalas. It wasn't the case. Afghanistan today, it's not the case. So what would be a rational paradigm? I mean, I will go ahead and say this, that it comes back to the first question that Crystal used, which is when a conflict becomes so ideological and so divisive, can you still use ethical norms? I would simply say that if there is still room for dialogue and for a negotiated outcome, but if we forget what we have learned over the decades of the 20th century, starting from Latin America, that people will not accept the legitimacy of a negotiation where equal room is given to people who have blood on their hands, civilian blood on their hands, and it doesn't matter what uniform they wear. Ask Afghans and ask Chileans or Argentines, and they will tell you the same thing. It doesn't matter if he was a jihadi warlord or if he was a government military officer. If we know that this person is a warlord in one way or the other and has taken civilian lives and abused them, we don't want that person to decide the future of our country. And unfortunately, because of our obsession with realpolitik, we only talk to the warlords on 2 or 3 sides. We do not talk to the civilians, who are the majority of the population. So I think with the new paradigm of conflict transformation, not just conflict management, there is a way out. But as long as we give equal weight or more weight to those who have blood on their hands and are continuing to do so, there may not be a way out.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Sorry, I'm giving too long answers. I'll be shorter.
Yeah, before I'm going to switch to the students, and then anyone else here want to give? Just to collect the question. Anyone else? Anyone else? Going once, going twice, okay. And then
let's collect. Yes. I'm going to talk too long.
Yara Saya, sophomore political science student. My questions are: the responsibility to protect was emphasized, and more specifically, not waiting until the problem reaches its peak. My question is that we discussed the importance of R2P, but in what ways can we protect? We didn't stress on the how to protect. And also, and to what extent does this intervention of R2P respect international policies? Or do we override some policies in order to protect, and is that all right? That's it.
My question is also for Dr. Barter. He mentioned something about this. If I'm correct, you were wary about the Western centrism of the R2P and that type of dialogue. Is that correct? Yeah. All right. My issue is that, well, historically we've moved from, let's say, white man's burden to white man's guilt, and where, we want to, respect your culture, how can we help your culture, how can we preserve it, how can we use it to help you, which is all fine and dandy. But to what extent is this paradox of, the responsibility, to protect, being a universalist type rhetoric, also be infused with a sort of relativist, very individualistic approach? How can we sort of carry out that balance?
I'm also a PS student. My name is Issam, and I was wondering if does R2P a field that places criteria for when the international community should interfere in another country? Would it place different criteria to say, why, for example, NATO interfered in Libya, but other countries have not interfered in Syria yet? And what are those criteria?
What are the criteria?
Yeah, hi, I'm Alex, Internet IFI. You touched a lot upon the question of how to intervene. I wanted to ask for your views about who intervenes, and especially since the last two foreign interventions, in my memory, were led by NATO forces, and what do you think that has done to the legitimization of the principle of RTP in the international world, and also whether you think a wider coalition of forces is needed for implementation of RTP for humanitarian.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least.
Well, sorry, I would like to make a comment, but I'll phrase it as a question, you know, to fit in with the scene, with my fellow students here. Why don't you bring in a little bit more economics into the argument? I really believe that bringing economics into the argument would not only help you reach a fuller picture, a more concrete view of things, but would also help you with early intervention. Because in many situations that we have, economics is at the root of the problems. In situations that are lively right now in the region, we have mafia-like regimes conspiring with other mafia-like regimes throughout the globe. And if we don't, I'm glad the commentator, in fact, pointed out to the need to pay heed to or promote a more just economic order is extremely important. And lastly, just one or two sentences. I believe that appealing to ethics, to art, to culture, etc., might be a little bit, if you'll excuse me, I might sound cynical here, but it goes with my age. It might be a bit too romantic. I think we need to bring things down as far as possible to economics. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I will give you the impossible task to group all these questions and try to come up with an answer in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Would you like to go first? Okay. Well, I'll start from the back and move up. And thank you for these fantastic questions and staying through. And I know your classes are starting up any minute. The economics. Luckily, I can answer that by saying that all my work on peace building has actually been, a huge part of it has been bringing attention to economics. You know, when I started working on post-conflict justice, I found, of course, it's understandable that everyone is looking at the human rights violations and the war crimes that happened during war, but how can you talk about justice unless you talk about the chronic structural injustices which led to the conflict in the first place and will continue after the conflict. So a huge part of my work has been broadening the concept of justice to bring in attention to the social justice, to redistributive justice, and I'm thrilled to say it's taken a long while, but now governments, policymakers, donors are beginning to realize it's a sine qua non. Unfortunately, they still couch it as development, but they're beginning to realize that it's about justice. Likewise, the other bit which you refer to the mafia, it has been also pushing the button to say, because many people in the DRC, in the Philippines are saying, I don't understand, you take our dictator to the ICC, but he's using his corrupt money and his mafia links to pay for the best lawyers. I met the lawyer of Charles Taylor, who told me, you know, I was defending all the gangsters in London, so I figured, hey, I can go and defend that gangster out there, you know, the Liberian gangster, no problem. So if we don't look at corruption and war economies, so a lot of my work on the ground across Africa was actually bringing war economies. We went to the Security Council and said, if you ignore the war economies in the DRC, you won't be able to end the conflict. I didn't talk about it now because I felt economics is inadequately but still addressed, whereas the other issues are not. Interestingly also, I found that in peace agreements, you would think that economics would be up there. It's usually the last thing that's discussed because the elite don't want to let go of their economic power. So you have to really push. Okay, I'd better be quicker with the other answers. who intervenes. It's great because you asked, how do you intervene? And you asked, who intervenes? Absolutely fundamental. And there we have the huge dilemma. Because what we realize now is if you are not careful about who intervenes, if it's always, Western NATO forces, there's a tendency to lose legitimacy. But very often, what we want to do is to look for the local, the regional supporters. Two problems. Usually neighbors have their own vested interests. Try to see what happened when India sent a peacekeeping force to Sri Lanka. They were the ones accused of most of the rapes and so on, but it's the same in every other part of the world, Nigeria and West Africa and so on. So there's that. And secondly, the lack of ethics, let's say, and accountable behavior by the local forces. So it remains a real catch-22 situation. They have advantages, they have disadvantages, so the best tends to be when there is a mixture. But there's absolutely no doubt that it needs to be much more legitimized. Interestingly enough, strangely enough, one could say, given the history, sometimes NATO forces tend to be seen as a better mixture of legitimate and effective, in some cases, at least in the early stages. You asked about, that I didn't say enough about how to intervene, and I want to draw attention to the fact that already, and the criteria for intervention, the most useful, because in the document that was adopted by the UN, there was just one and a half paragraphs, let's say. And then there was, if you look at number one, the actual report, which is very small, it's not a typical, international report, which is like this, and you look at it and you yawn. It's very short, and they spell out very clearly the criteria that should be used. And a lot of it has to do with, let's choose cases where there is a legitimate need, where there is a chance of, there's local demand. There's a chance that we can succeed because the people actually want us, both the governing parties as well as the people on the ground. Of course, we only intervene because the government is either unwilling or unable to act, so it's a little bit idealistic, but the criteria are very clearly spelled out, and subsequently the UN, with the special advisor, has tried to extrapolate and elaborate what would be the criteria, in which cases would we go in, so that it is not expanded. For example, when there was the cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, people said, shouldn't we go in? And people who had crafted the R2P concept said, no. We had a long discussion, and we said we will not apply R2P when it's an environmental or humanitarian disaster. Okay, so that was a big discussion, but that was the case. Unfortunately, those criteria are there. They're not consistently applied. So there's some kind of understanding of when we should intervene, what are the cases which justify intervention, but it doesn't always happen, which comes to your question of how. And there again, I want to draw attention to the fact that what the crafters of R2P, and even now the UN, would emphasize is, please remember that it's not just military intervention. There's all these tools, just like the tools for dispute settlement in the UN system. I mean, there are all these steps, these gradations, starting off with, in a sense, what you could say Kofi Annan did unsuccessfully in Syria, but successfully in Kenya. And now we'll have presidential elections, and maybe they'll be much, much better based on what's going on so far. So early in the day, sending in fact-finding missions, having high-level preventive diplomacy, having sanctions starting with not the ones which will hurt the civilians, but targeted sanctions, et cetera, so that really you're pushing the military to the very last. And I would emphasize that because, as I said, I've hardly ever seen a case of a good military intervention, however good it was in the beginning. The beginning is always the best part, and then it tends to go downhill. Who, why, you. I mean, I enjoyed your intervention so much, I don't even know if I need to give an answer, but I will come to that. You talked about how do you balance the universal with the individual. And the greatest thing is, it's only when we recognize the individual or the sui generis, culturally specific differentiation, the differences between, that we can actually construct something which is universal and is acceptable. And our problem has been, being split between the cosmopolitans and the communitarians, we tend to think of it as we love to do in black and white and either or, but actually you can only arrive at a cosmopolitan by passing through a communitarian, just as if you get stuck in communitarianism and don't recognize the cosmopolitan, you're lost. So I think it's really a question of marrying the two and recognizing that if you want an international norm to have any validity, it will only do so if in each case you make reference to the specific context, including its, the cultural, ethical, economic, historical, geographic, etc. Was there anyone else who spoke before that? I think I covered everyone. Anyone dissatisfied? No. Okay. Oh, I'll just ask you, Professor, that if I talk about economics, are you okay if we talk about culture and ethics as well? You wouldn't exclude them? Living in this country, I'm certain you wouldn't. Since you're sitting in the country which has the oldest city in the world and the first written alphabet, I'm sure you wouldn't dismiss the importance of culture and ethics.
Dictatorial in any way. I'm not in a position to be dictatorial. You can talk about whatever, but economics is at the root of many of the problems that we face, and we ought to address it as often as possible.
And ethics is a very good way to deal with our economics problems. Sure.
Okay, thank you. Before I close, I just want to thank also Issam and IF5 for organizing all this very efficiently. And I'd like to thank Dr. Mani for a very stimulating discussion, and also Alex Barder for his intervention. This will be, as you can tell, available on the video on the IFI website. Gareth Evans, who was mentioned several times, actually came to UB a couple of years ago, and his presentation is also online at the IFI website. And there are a number of other things, so I encourage you to keep on checking the website and for future events as well. So thank you very much.